The honourable member for Dufferin-Caledon.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. It's always a great day when I get to rise in this chamber and speak on behalf of the residents of Dufferin-Caledon. I want to point out that I will be sharing my time with the member for Steveston, Richmond East. I got that wrong. First thing I want to do is I want to acknowledge the importance of the path to reconciliation. This is something that's critical for our country. If we take a look at some of the things that are going on in the past few weeks, these are exact representations of the failure of reconciliation. I want to talk about briefly, before I get into the main part of my remarks, some of the things that have gone on in this country that have been so detrimental to Indigenous peoples. And the first thing that jumps out at me is, up till 1960, Indigenous people could only vote if they gave up their status. This is a shameful, shameful history in this country and something that needs to be addressed through reconciliation. The issue I have today is this particular piece of legislation is really about, in my estimation, virtue signaling. It's the low-hanging fruit. If this were the 94th of 94 recommendations that we were to proceed on, well, then let's talk about it. But in fact, it's not. My colleague from the NDP has just pointed out that we are at 9 of 94 recommendations that have been completed. 9 in 5 years. So if you work that out, it is 2.25 per year. And to complete them all, it will take 38 years. The path that this government is on for reconciliation is a winding, meandering path that is taking us absolutely nowhere quickly. Now, I also want to talk about the fact that we have precious time in this chamber. If you look at the 42nd Parliament, you might wonder how many pieces of government legislation actually passed. Well, I took a look. It's 85. And when you factor out budget implementation bills and other things, and the budget, it's actually significantly less than that. It's around 73, which is about 15 or 16 pieces of legislation passed per year. Why am I saying this is an issue? Well, let's talk about that. Because there's 94 recommendations that have been put forward by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And there's been action on 9. So let's look at some of the things that have not been proceeded on. I want to talk about that just a little bit, because I think it's important to look at what they're not doing when you look at what they're actually doing. So there were 18 recommendations based under the category of justice. How many do you think this government has accomplished? Half? No? 25%? No. One. That's all they've done. And guess what? We're dealing with an amendment to the citizenship oath. But guess what there are in those recommendations? I'm going to start with 1. Recommendation number 33. Under justice, we call upon the federal, provincial, and territorial governments to recognize as a high priority the need to address and prevent fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and to develop, in collaboration with Aboriginal people, FASD preventative programs that can be delivered in a culturally appropriate manner. Is that what we're debating today? Is that what we're going to be debating down the road? No, it's not. You know why? Because that's a tough one, where they actually have to get their nose to the grindstone and do some real work. That's right. And they're not. So they put this one in to say, hey, look, we're doing something. Guess what? It's time to move past doing something and actually work on the issues that are of critical importance. I will point out one more under justice, and this one is within the exclusive jurisdiction of the federal government. We call upon the federal government to provide more support for Aboriginal programming in halfway houses and parole services. Where are we on that, Madam Speaker? Has any progress been made on that? No, it absolutely has not. And guess what? This is what we're dealing with. I'm going to continue. Child welfare. There's 5 recommendations under child welfare. How many have been completed by this government? Wait for it. 0. It is 0. And if you look at some of the recommendations there, recommendation number 4 under child welfare, we call upon the federal government, again, this is the federal government. They can't say, oh, we have provincial partners and others that aren't doing anything. Right. This is the federal government. We call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong one, I apologize. We call upon the federal government to enact Aboriginal childcare legislation that establishes national standards for Aboriginal child apprehension and custody cases that include principles. That is something incredibly worth pursuing. And with the precious time that we have in this House, why would this not be what we're debating today? Instead, we're talking about a symbolic gesture. And what I can tell, First Nation communities, Indigenous communities are tired of symbolic gestures. They want real action on reconciliation. I'm also going to speak of education. How many recommendations are there in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with respect to education? There are 7. Wow. And how many has this government actually completed out of those 7? It will be no surprise, based on the previous answer, it is 0. Nothing. Nothing has been done. And guess what? There's another one, exclusively within federal jurisdiction. They can't once again say, oh, these are the provinces, or like they like to do, bring out the big boogeyman about the Premier of Ontario, Doug Ford. They can't blame him for this. Number 7, we call upon the federal government to develop with Aboriginal groups a joint strategy to eliminate educational and employment gaps between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal Canadians. Why is that not what we're debating? Once again, this is the hard work that has to be done. In fact, right now, there's a $10 billion class action lawsuit against this government for underfunding education. Are we dealing with that? No, they're tied up in court. So guess what? They're going to say, look over here, we're making changes to the citizenship oath. Don't worry about all this other substantive stuff that we're not doing. Recommendation number 8, also under education, also the federal government. We call upon the federal government to eliminate the discrepancy in federal education funding for First Nations children being educated on reserve and those First Nations children being educated off reserve. Once again, Madam Speaker, we have crickets from this government on a significant and substantial recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And the action from this government is like their action on so many files. It is absolutely non-existent. Indigenous communities deserve better than virtue signaling on the citizenship oath. My final points are going to be with respect to health. There are 7 recommendations with respect to health. Now, I'm on a bit of a roll here, Madam Speaker, so I'm going to say this. How many of the 7 recommendations on health has this government completed? 0. Thank you very much. That is exactly it. And number 21, we call upon the federal government to provide sustainable funding and new Aboriginal healing centres to address the physical, mental, emotional, spiritual harms caused by residential schools and to ensure that the funding of healing centres in Nunavut and the Northwest Territories is a priority. Madam Speaker, I will conclude by saying this. Why is that not what we're debating here in the House today instead of something simple and easy like a change to the citizenship oath? Indigenous Canadians deserve real action on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and this isn't it.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Guelph.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to the Honourable Member across the way, but I'm left a little confused, Madam Speaker. When the comments are made that we are doing nothing as a government, in the education transformation of First Nations people. I'd ask the honourable member if, through you, if he could maybe refer to the sac-iscgc.ca website, where we show the new policy for First Nations kindergarten to grade 12 and the progress on investments in kindergarten to grade 12 education and the new engagement programs from 2016 to 2018, the current systems for First Nations education in Canada, what we've heard in the past and what we're doing now and what the report's recommendations are. It's all here, Madam Speaker, as is the investment in 13 new schools in First Nations. Madam Speaker, we are making unprecedented investments in education for First Nations people, but of course there's always more to go. There's more room to improve, and when we look at university input, there's things we can do to help students get into university as well. But it's, Madam Speaker, through you, if the new member has maybe not seen this report, maybe he could comment on if he's seen it, and if he has seen it, why he's ignoring it.
For Dufferin-Caledon.
Actually, Madam Speaker, I'll correct my colleague. I'm not a new member. In fact, I've been a member in this chamber from 2011 to 2015. I served on the then called Aboriginal Affairs Committee for the entire duration. So what I can say is this. Citing one or two things to try and suggest they're doing a great job is a great way to try and divert attention from the abysmal points that I raised in my speech. And if things are so sunny and wonderful that the member for Guelph says, look at all this great stuff we're doing, why is there a $10 billion class action lawsuit against this government by Indigenous groups for their lack of funding education?
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Cowichan. Appropriated right, Malahat Langford.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I want to center my comments and questions on call to action number 94 and Bill C6. Now, my colleagues, the Conservatives have put forward an amendment to this bill to effectively kill it at second reading, and I understand there are some concerns over the language and call to action number 94. I'm just wondering if there is a version of this oath that would be acceptable to the member. And if so, why is his party trying to kill the bill at this stage rather than send it to committee where we could get feedback from witnesses and maybe try and find something that's acceptable to all parties in this House? Thank you, Madam Speaker.
For Dufferin-Caledon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Well, I can say, listening to the remarks that have been made by my colleagues in the Bloc and the NDP, that this particular piece of legislation will pass to second reading and it will go to committee to be studied. The primary objection I'm raising today is this, and I think I made it very clear in my speech. We have precious House time. We have pressing recommendations from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Our time, Canadians' time, Indigenous communities' time will be better served with legislation that deals with the critical needs of those communities, not this. That's my objection. That's why I'm proposing we don't proceed with this bill.
Questions and comments, questions et commentaires. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Yes, Madam Speaker. The Conservative members have actually stood up and said that they don't want to progress with the bill because they don't support the legislation. And when the member talks about the number of calls for action that have been taken, he makes reference to 9 or 10. There's 94. Many of those recommendations have nothing to do directly with the federal government. There's other jurisdictions, Madam Speaker. Many of the recommendations involve the federal government working with Indigenous people and other levels of government. My question to the member is, can he tell me how many calls for action did Stephen Harper ever actually take act on?
For Dufferin-Caledon.
I think the member opposite has forgotten that it was actually a Conservative government that brought forward the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the Commission delivered its report in 2015. Then he may recall there was an election in which his government was elected. And the point I raised in my speech was very clearly, yes, there are some that deal with provincial jurisdiction and others. But guess what? I spoke about the ones that are exclusively within federal jurisdiction. And this member's party and the members on that side of the House have done absolutely nothing to advance them. Zero, zip, zilch. Let me tell you, it's shameful. They should do better.